Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ayana Elizabeth, co-host of Climate One. Thank you for joining us for this live conversation with Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, co-founder of the All We Can Save Project, a marine biologist and policy expert, along with 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben and Earthjustice President Abigail Dillen. We're recording today's conversation for the Climate One podcast and radio show, which drops every Friday. You can subscribe wherever you get your pods. At the end of today's conversation, we will take questions from you, the audience. Please write your name and a concise question on the cards on your seats. Megan will collect them, and I'll call people by name to the microphone, and you can go in the order called. Before we get into our main conversation, we have an exciting special treat. We want to kick things off with a poem. Bill McKibben and Abigail Dillen are only a couple of the many brilliant thinkers and doers in Ayana Elizabeth Johnson's new book, What If We Get It Right? The book includes a lot of poets, such as two-time National Poetry Champion Steve Connell. This work explores democracy and technology, climate and racial justice, family and grief, purpose and possibility, and of course, love. And he's here with us today to present this living earth. Welcome to Climate One.
Welcome, how are you feeling? Good? All right, so I am reading a poem written for the book, and something changed on Saturday, which is, you all know Ayana, you know of Ayana, you know the remarkable that is Ayana. I've known about it from a distance in this way, and on Saturday it shifted, and as I hold this book in my hand, I saw her not just as my cousin, but suddenly as the world sees her. And in reading of her beginnings, in the beginning of her book, and seeing pictures of her learning to swim with her dad, my uncle, and her origin story of how she first fell in love with fish and the ocean, which made me think of my dad, her uncle, and this poem about his love of fish. I get to ask dumb questions in the tropical fish store because the most I am is 5 years old. Sometimes I'm only 4. Now, both our dads have passed in the last few years, but I know how proud and delighted they would both be to be here today to read her book. Now, the poem you're about to hear, page 381 in the book, thank you, Ayana, is a little bit different from some of the poems I'm known for, which is to say I'm best known as a spoken word artist, and many of my poems are written with the performance in mind, and this was written exclusively for her book. But don't worry, after our first show, I got this text from her mother, my Aunt Louise. Steve, I wanted to commend your decision to stay in place and use subtle hand and body gestures to lightly dramatize the text. Your poem thereby stood out and really came alive and clear for me. An excellent reading. It was meant to be read aloud. As is clear to you all, it is an honor to be a contributor to this amazing book by Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. It's something else still to be her family. And most remarkable of all is to be both. And that's what her book and the poem I'm going to read now are about. All the many things we can do to protect and respect and resurrect this remarkable home on which we live as one incredible family that is made up of all life on earth. So please enjoy the aunt, uncle, mom, dad, cousin, family-approved poem and the incredible conversation that will follow as we all begin to look forward to what happens if we get it right. Believe about the beginnings what you will. This much we know for certain. At some point, darkness released its grip on light. The night cracked wide, the universe unclenched its jaws, and life began to talk. The very synapses of existence began firing at once, moving as one thought. Since the beginning, it has been this way, when all life on earth communicated without words. And still, today, in the twisting swirl of a million butterflies, the schools of fish fast twitching in the surf, and the delicate reaching up of vines, in the shared mind of a stampede pounding, or beneath ground in the sound of mycelial nerves extending, this resounding language of connection is observed. Oh, but at some point, the harmony was broken, a dissonance occurred, and slowly the new song of humankind was heard with words like, you know these words, right? Manifest destiny, industrial revolution, dominion over all, survival of the fittest, urban sprawl. And as the song of life became a solo, a new thought began. Perhaps the world was not alive after all, but we were simply alive on it. Oh, and with that thought, the world became a fixed thing. It simply was, as the sun or space or rocks, as if it could never be diminished, as if our actions could never cause it harm. But we were wrong. And now we have evolved to become both destroyer and savior. Our behavior is our greatest threat, yet hope resides in our resolve, in our collective compassion and formidable talents. The way we rise to any challenge, once we accept, we have no choice. And that is why, if from this moment forward in our voice, you once again hear this harmony with the earth, then from out of our destruction, our rebirth comes. And isn't that what life does best? It goes on. Oh, when it seems like it is finished, it survives. That is why in the most hostile conditions in existence, something thrives. From toxic soil, a mushroom grows. In a desiccated riverbed, water flows. In a still, smoldering forest, a flower leans into the wind. And in the midst of this vast expanse spins a planet comprised of promise, spark of light, oxygen and bone, photosynthesis, salt water, honeycomb, hydrogen atom, skin cell, hair follicle, matted fur, acetone, slice of wing, wind current, opposable thumb, cyclone, dorsal fin, deep breath, ozone, atmospheric river, heart valve, limestone. All life is connected. Nothing lives alone on this one and only living earth. Home.
Steve Connell, thank you so much. Very, very powerful. The power of poetry. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce marine biologist, policy expert, writer, and teacher, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She co-founded the Urban Ocean Lab and the All We Can Save project, and she co-created and co-hosted the Climate Solutions podcast, How to Save a Planet. She also authored the new book, What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures, which she'll be signing in the lobby after the show. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, welcome to Climate One. Hello.
Hi, is this okay? We're live.
We are. We're live on this planet. I want to start with something that I think was a recent journey for you. You went to the Arctic in July, and you wrote this was to see the ice before it's gone. Mm-hmm. On LinkedIn, you wrote how incredibly beautiful it was and how the experience let you fall even more in love with our planet, but you had to hold that wonder while also knowing and watching, the glaciers fall apart. This is something I think a lot of us are struggling to balance with our own beloved places. So how do you suggest we balance those feelings?
That's funny. I have been asked a few times lately, what if there's something I wish I had studied to better equip me for being a useful person in this moment? And I just keep thinking psychology, right? So much of this is about how we deal with change or resist it, what motivates us, what makes us freeze up. And that's just not my area of expertise. Far be it from me to tell other people how to manage their emotions. But I think the gift is that there can be endless beauty amidst the chaos and destruction. And some of that beauty comes from how we look out for each other. The way we care for each other is like so heartwarming, can be. And walruses, have you ever seen a walrus in the wild? They're so ridiculous. And it was just, such a treat to be there. And then, of course, you're looking at this ice and the colors of the blues, the turquoise, that like royal blue. I have never seen anything like that, even in the Caribbean. But then you're looking at, these glaciers, and the guide says, oh, those used to connect, and now they're 2 miles apart, right? And we had to go, I was circumnavigating Svalbard, and we actually had to go north of Svalbard to reach pack ice in the summer. I mean, the Arctic could be ice-free within a decade in the summers.
Yeah.
Just a completely different ecosystem, right? And currents will change, and food webs will change, and all of this. And so, obviously, change is the constant, and just embracing that. I mean, I think I'm known for advocating for finding joy in climate action, and I think it's important to allow that to be small things, not like a constant skipping giddiness, but like appreciating beauty and love and all of it whenever it appears.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, you fell in love with coral reefs at age 5.
I love a love segue.
And you put in your book that it's just as coral reefs were dying, but perhaps the same could be said of a 5-year-old today, because they're still dying. So there's this term shifting baselines that kind of captures that what we experience as normal or static really isn't. Things change, and then we kind of come to think that they were, aren't what they used to be, and so forth. I'm not explaining it that well.
This is a term coined by Professor Daniel Pauly, the most cited fisheries biologist in the world. Someone I really, really look up to. And yes, it's this idea that whatever you first saw an ecosystem as, you assume that's the baseline, even though it probably was much more resplendent in the past. And so basically we have like lowered expectations.
And they continue, right?
Yeah.
They continue as we evolve, as we continue to change those places. So how have you witnessed that and your own shifting baselines in your career?
My mom's like, that's not a lot of insects. I'm like, there's so many bugs in the garden. She was like, no. She's like, you're in denial too. So I think it's so important to have these multi-generational relationships, collaborations when it comes to climate work. So I know Bill McKibben's coming up here soon, but I'm just so enamored with the work Third Act is doing, making sure elders are organized and collaborating with young folks in the movement.
Yeah, we'll talk about that shortly. So, you spend a lot of time studying the oceans, and they have absorbed a tremendous amount of the carbon we've emitted.
About a third.
Yeah, and excess heat that we've generated.
Over 90%.
By burning fossil fuels. The
Earth would be like 97 degrees hotter Fahrenheit if it weren't for the ocean absorbing all that
Which is
heat.
Remarkable.
And thank you, ocean, but also so sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was reading recently that the House Science Committee is working on draft legislation to guide research into technologies to pull carbon from the ocean. I wasn't even aware, this was news to me, I wasn't aware that we could do that that's like
this
a technology.
This is also news to me.
Well, there we go.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do you think? I mean, we know we can remove carbon from the atmosphere, and there's a lot of technology and efforts underway for that, but this is about removing carbon dioxide from the ocean.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's very important to say we don't know when we don't know, and I don't know what the technology is. I have no concept of like what the side effects of that would be. For carbon capture from the air, I mean, it's not really happening at a large scale. A lot of people are thinking about it as like a get out of jail free card, right? Where you can just keep burning all the fossil fuels you want and then somehow magically suck all that excess carbon out of the air. It just doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of energy to run these carbon removal systems. And so that really needs, Kate Marvel, NASA climate scientist, and I talk about this in the first interview in the book, and she's like, that can be used to suck out the stuff that's already there, but not as an excuse to just keep emitting. The physics of that will never make sense.
Right.
Maybe it's worth saying there's 20 interviews in this book, which is why when you said that I co-authored it, that wasn't really wrong, And there's 5 poems, and of course lots of quotes, and even a bunch of really sweet art.
Yeah, it's a great book. In your book, you write really beautifully about your parents, and you tell the story of your Black father who moved to New York from Jamaica to go to college and become an architect. And you say that it wasn't until after he passed away that you understood the nature of his success in his field. Yeah. Can you tell us that story?
Well, I didn't think he had any success because he didn't have any fancy buildings he could point to and claim credit for. And maybe I could just read the sentences because I chose the words so carefully. Yeah. I don't want to botch it. Every day of my childhood, he would get up, Sisyphean, put on a sharp suit, buy a newspaper and a pack of Doublemint gum, take the subway into Manhattan, and try to make headway as a Black man in this notoriously insular and racist field. I'm ashamed to admit that I thought he was a failure. He didn't have fancy buildings to point to and claim. He never made any money to speak of. It wasn't until a few years ago, after he had passed away, that I was disabused of that perception when I happened to meet a Black architect, a generation his junior, at a cocktail party. This man knew of my dad's architecture firm, which is one of the first Black-owned firms in New York City. With glints of respect and gratitude, this man informed me that my father had indeed paved the way and opened doors just as he had intended. My tears of relief welled up. My dad had achieved his ultimate goal. I tell you this in part because I am proud, but really I tell you this because I had missed the entire freaking point. It's not about the glory, it's about the ripples. This is what progress often looks like. Success without rewards.
How does that shape your approach to the climate change work that you do?
I mean, I think the best gift my parents have given me is to just absolutely keep my ego in check. As Steve can vouch, my mother is not one for handing out participation trophies, right? And neither my father. I mean, the number of compliments I got from him is sort of a joke, good job, kid. I would get that 4 times a year, and I'd be like, yes. And I think the way that manifests is they didn't have any particular ambition on my behalf. All they said to me was, you have to give back. You've had all of these opportunities. I had scholarships to all the best schools. You have to whom much is given, much is expected. There are innumerable ways to give back, just choose something. And also that you're not a savior. You can help, but there's no expectation that I'm gonna save the world, right? And sort of that combination of low expectations for impact, but high expectations for effort and commitment and values, I think was a really helpful match. But my mother was very much the world needs more Black scientists. So she did encourage me in that direction, but also being half Jamaican, thinking about the ways in which the degradation of the ocean is a cultural issue. And so I think about climate and environmental issues very much as harmful to coastal communities and cultures, not just economies and safety and health.
Right. So there's this really lovely illustration, or I should say graphic in your book that I want to talk about. You write that 70% of Americans are worried about climate change. Most don't even talk about it with their friends and family, though. And the 11% of Americans, 37 million people who are willing to become actively engaged, haven't taken action. That's a big number of people, and climate can feel lots of things, right? It can feel daunting, overwhelming, scary, but you've created a Venn diagram to help people understand where they can find their climate action, and this speaks to what you were just talking about. So for those who are not in the room with us, can you describe these 3 overlapping circles and
Sure.
How they work?
I love a Venn diagram. So the first circle is, what are you good at? So what are your skills, your resources, your networks? What can you specifically bring to the table? And this is a reaction, essentially, to the environmental movement from my perspective for many years, giving everyone a very similar and generic list of things we should all do, right? Vote, protest, donate, spread the word, lower your own carbon footprint, which is, of course, a term popularized by Ogilvy on behalf of BP. So thanks. And what a loss if we're all just doing the same things. Please do those things, by the way. Like I do them. We should all be doing them. And yet, we need to bring our special magic, our superpowers into the mix too. So what are you good at? And I think it's worth saying we should be very generous with ourselves about that category. Like, are you really good at planning parties? That would be helpful. Do you make good websites? We need those. Are you just like an incredible project manager? Great, we need that too. This is not about like engineering per se, right? Or only politics. So what work needs doing? There are hundreds, if not millions, of climate and justice solutions. So I recommend that people check out Project Drawdown for a list if you need some inspiration. So drawdown.org has all these different climate solutions, their relative benefits on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. And then on top of that, they also, because Catherine Wilkinson was their editor-in-chief there for a while. She was the lead writer on Drawdown, as well as the Drawdown Review, which came after that. You can download for free on their website and is actually, I think, much better and clear. Really good graphic design. I'm obsessed with good design. And it talks about the accelerators for climate, so implementing climate solutions, right? Things like politics and culture. So what work needs doing? Pick something. And then the third circle is what brings you joy. So as we were talking about before, these sources of satisfaction and delight, not this very superficial, in my estimation, American pursuit of happiness. I just don't care if we're happy all the time as long as we're being useful and kind and all these other things.
Joy is different than happiness,
It's
too.
totally different.
Joy is...
And I would say, like, if everyone could just be slightly goofier, I'd really appreciate that too. I think this whole book tour, I'm like, can we take climate change seriously? But like, please don't take ourselves seriously. Like, it's so boring. So that's my pitch. Take it or leave it. But what brings you joy? And so finding our way to our own sort of bespoke climate action in the heart of those three circles is what I would encourage each of us to do.
I think it's really powerful because it really does, the intersection of these things is what also will keep you engaged, right?
Yeah, if you pick something you're really good at but makes you miserable, no one's going to want to collaborate with you, and we need to build a bigger, stronger team, and you'll probably burn out.
Right.
And, this is the work of our lifetimes, so please don't pick something awful to do.
And there's plenty of work needing done, right?
Yeah.
You say that this question...
It's perhaps worth mentioning that I drew this at the time I was trying to think of what I was going to do next, and then later found out this is sort of a simplified version of the Japanese concept of ikigai for finding your purpose, which has 5 circles. One of them is about what you can earn money doing. I've notably omitted that, which tells you something about the way I think about the world. And I don't remember what the 5th one is. But that's what led me to co-found Urban Ocean Lab, this policy think tank for the future of coastal cities, as a marine biologist, as a Brooklyn native, as someone who finds a lot of joy in changing policy, changing the rules of the game, and design, and just really worried about coastal cities being unprepared for the impacts of sea level rise in particular. So not everyone should start a dorky policy think tank, but that was absolutely at the heart of my own climate action Venn diagram.
Yeah, and you've done wonderful things with it. I just want to ask you one more question, and then we'll invite Bill McKibben up here. You say that this question, what if we get it right, isn't asked enough. Why isn't it asked more, and what's sort of the importance in asking it?
I don't know why it's not asked more. This is another human psychology question. Maybe we gravitate towards the apocalypse.
I think that's true.
I don't know. I don't know if there's any
Easier to
studies
envision
on
a
that.
dark future.
I think I'm just going to cheat and answer this the way I answered it in the book, if that's okay. I would say here, if we're honest, maybe we doubt that humanity actually can get it together, can rally the depth of motivation and creativity required to face this unprecedentedly gargantuan challenge. But one thing is certain. Half-assed action in the face of potential doom is an indisputably absurd choice, especially given that we already have most of the climate solutions we need, heaps of them. Moving forward requires that we propel each other, propel our species, out of a phenomenally entrenched procrastination. We don't need more data or a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis. We need to leap. But I get it. For decades, what scientists, writers, filmmakers, and artists have projected for us is the apocalypse in great detail. We can easily picture the climate change-fueled fires, floods, droughts, and storms, and the immense suffering, all of which are now well underway. However, when it comes to better outcomes, we've largely been left hanging. That is a problem. Humans evolved to not leap into a void. That's dangerous. So we need something firm to aim for, something with love and joy in it, and we need the gumption that emerges from an effervescent sense of possibility. So essentially, I wrote this book because it's the book I needed to read, right? Show me the way forward. And I came up with this title, What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. And I was like, oh, how do I answer this question? Who am I, to answer a question this enormous and fundamental? And so then I, called all my smartest friends to help me answer it. And instead of paraphrasing them, I let them all speak for themselves. The audiobook is essentially a 20-episode podcast season mashed up into one. You get to hear all their voices and my essays, and the poets read their own poems. And so that was more of a side project probably than Penguin Random House Audio intended to embark on, but thank you to that team.
That's great. Well, let's welcome Bill McKibben up here. And I want to ask you, while he's making his way up here, what you thought when you first met Bill. You met him 25 years ago?
Oh, yeah. I was a
Welcome, Bill.
sophomore or junior. I met Bill when I was taking a seminar class at Harvard College, probably in 2000. I think I was a junior. There were only 12 students in the class with Professor Jim McCarthy, oceanographer who was one of the lead authors of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change third assessment report. And the whole class received a binder of the draft. For those who are listening and cannot see my hands, it was a very, very thick binder. And that was our textbook for the class. And I sort of skimmed it, and I vaguely paid attention. I was like, oh, this sounds really bad. Especially the parts about how many people would have to move, to migrate because of sea level rise, et cetera. But I was truly an awful student in undergraduate. But I just remember thinking, these two are very smart. I should maybe read their books someday. And here we are.
Here we are.
It only took 20 years for me to come back around to having the depth of conversation I probably should have had in college.
Well, you can give yourself grace for that, I think.
Sure. I'll take some grace for that.
Welcome, Bill McKibben. Long before you founded Third Act, which we'll talk about in a minute, and even before you founded or co-founded 350.org, you wrote The End of Nature. And Ayana, in her book, calls this the first popular press book on climate change. That was in 1989. What were you seeing then that others weren't?
Well, let me say, first of all, because I wrote the first book about all this, I get sent every book that there is about climate change. And they're of varying quality, let us say. This book of Ayana's is really important and belongs on every climate bookshelf that there is. In 1989, we had, I mean, the horror actually of this story is we had fair warning.
Yeah.
We knew what was coming. The scientific process worked to provide us with a clear consensus picture of what was going to unfold if we didn't stop burning coal and oil and gas. We didn't stop burning coal and oil and gas. We've put more CO2 in the atmosphere since 1989 than in all of human history before. And so now one has the completely unhappy moment of everything that we warned about starting to happen. In fact, more than starting, everything breaking over our heads. I mean, we're sitting here a few days after a rainstorm, a hurricane and a rainstorm that left vast corner of this country wrecked,
Right.
just turned upside down, and not for the first time, for the 100th time. And that's just this country.
And it was accelerated, right, by warmer oceans and
I mean, this is
warmer temperature.
absolutely. We're now living in the last 18 months have seen a rapid spike in the planet's temperature, which had been ramping steadily up. But we've had the hottest days on this Earth in 125,000 years, which means all of us are living on a hotter planet than anyone we would really ever recognize as a fellow human has ever lived on.
Mm-hmm.
And the results are miserable, as one would expect. And the prospect, of course, is that it will get much worse before it gets better. That's how the physics of this is going to play out. But that's precisely why the message of this book is so important. We have, and this is the key part always to remember, a few years to make very, very dramatic changes, the biggest changes humans have made in how they organize their economies in hundreds of years. And if we don't do it, this will get much, much worse. But it's entirely possible to do it. Mm-hmm. We have, as Ayana says, the tools that we need. We can begin to see them starting to be deployed. The question is whether or not we will do it at a pace that begins to catch up with the physics of climate change. And that in turn depends on, I think, at least in part, some of those questions of psychology that Ayana keeps discussing. I mean,
how quickly and how justly, right?
Absolutely.
There's different possible futures that we just further entrench inequality, and that's no good.
Absolutely. So far, we've run this climate movement, which we've both played our part to help build, on mostly fear and anxiety and guilt and sadness, all of which are entirely appropriate emotions, and all of which have had their power. But we've probably maxed out the number of people that we can get with those, and they've begun to cause often a kind of paralyzing grief and anxiety.
Yeah.
So now we need to draw on other emotions, hope and joy and a sense of adventure, which are very real. We're California, where we are, in the last year, has finally, in advance of almost any place on the planet, installed enough solar panels and enough batteries that for the last 100 days, California has produced more than 100% of the electricity that it uses every day from renewable resources. That's a first. When the sun goes down at night, the biggest source of supply to the California grid is batteries that did not exist on that grid 3 years ago.
Yeah.
2024 compared to 2023, California has used 29% less natural gas to generate electricity than it did last year. 29% is a big number, a number big enough that spread around the world.
Huge deal.
Spread around the world, that takes a big chunk, starts to take a chunk out of the 3 degrees Celsius that we're staring in the face of. But it has to happen, this change, very fast.
Right.
Because if it doesn't happen fast, then it doesn't do us much good. No one has a plan for how to freeze the Arctic back up again once it's melted.
Right. Well, I'm sure there will be plans for that.
And they'll probably come from sort of near here one day.
It's possible. Bill, you've spent a number of years, or maybe really the last decade, focused on money. And you and Naomi Klein and others spurred a fossil fuel divestment campaign beginning in 2012. About $40 trillion, I think I have that number right, in university endowment funds and pension funds have since been pulled out of fossil fuels. That's a huge number. And fossil fuels continue to be, mined or pumped and drilled and used and burned. So what evidence do you have that divestment is having an effect?
Well, I mean, we've slowed down. We've made it more expensive to do this work, and the coal industry can't really find much capital anymore to expand. But the oil and gas industry continues to find capital, in part because the biggest banks in the world and the four biggest funders of fossil fuel on the planet are Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, continue to hand out loans, even though the scientific community has been absolutely clear that we cannot build more fossil fuel infrastructure. Mm-hmm. They told us to stop 4 years ago. Said,
those
no
banks,
more.
You told me, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America have provided about $1.5 trillion in financing to fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement was signed, where we all agreed we should ramp down those things.
And that number's just kept going up, which is why, 1,000 of us went to jail this summer sits outside Citibank in New York. It's unconscionable what institutions in the name of the most short-sighted, short-term greed are willing to do. They will break the planet if we don't manage to stop this quickly.
And are you seeing, there's one bank you wrote about in the interview with Ayana in here that did make a marked change, but those four haven't, to my knowledge. So, I mean, are you seeing...
They're starting to make, actually the craziest part of it is that they've all made some noises, we're going to go net zero or whatever. We'll do it someday. But nobody is willing to just bite the bullet and get down to it, which is quite annoying because,
to put it mildly.
One understands why Exxon is, are amoral actors. They know how to do one thing in the world, drill for oil and set it on fire. But, Chase Bank, this is a relatively small part of their business. They can make outsized profits doing lots of other things, including the thing that we actually need to do on this planet, which is deploy lots of capital to build solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries as fast as ever we can.
What's holding them back? Is it...
The CEO of Exxon said earlier this year that his company would never invest in renewables because they don't return above average profits for our shareholders. And in that, he's correct, in that you can make plenty of money putting up solar panels, but you can't make Exxon-sized money. And the reason is because once you've put them up, then the sun delivers the energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. Exxon can't control the sun's output and store it up and sell it to us a little bit at a time. It's a great gift from the world around us that we can take advantage of, and that's spectacular news for humanity. We're at the moment when if we could seize it, we could stop burning things on planet Earth in short order. That's, not only might save the climate, but 9 million people a year, one death in 5 on this planet comes from breathing the particulates that go when you burn fossil fuel, which we do not need to do anymore. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to make power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun, okay? That we continue to do that is down mostly, really entirely, to the fact that the small number of people who own oil wells and coal mines refuse to part with their business model. And if we can't make them do it, which is why we organize in the ways we do, then we have little prospect. Right. But I think we can make them do it, or at least we can give it a good try.
So Ayana mentioned your organization, Third Act, and I want to get to that. This is aimed at activating folks over 60 in their quote-unquote third act of life. For you personally, how has your approach to activism changed in this phase of life?
Well, I mean, I've been at this a while, since I wrote The End of Nature when I was in my mid-20s, so I'm now in my mid-60s. So it's been a lifetime's work. And the motivations shift some. You know, I'm going to be dead before the very worst of this hits. So it's not anymore quite myself I'm thinking about, but as you get nearer the exit than the entrance, terms like legacy start to become less abstract. I mean, legacy is the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. We're about to be the first generations to leave behind a planet worse than the one we inherited, which no one wants. You know, I have now a 6-month-old grandchild, and that means I'm deeply in love with someone who's going to be here in the 22nd century, God willing. And so that does shift how one thinks about time and the future.
There's actually new polling on specifically this motivation that says, when advocating for climate action, love for protecting future generations is the biggest motivator, 12 times more popular than job creation or economic growth, which is great, that people aren't just motivated by money and sort of like, yes, these executives are, but not the average person. But I used to think that was kind of corny, like do it for love kind of thing. It's like so, I'm like
You're a romantic, come on.
But I think of like climate action as like just, of course we're going to try to make this better, right? Like you don't have to get all romantic about it, and especially as someone without children, like it's not something that I always thought of as like my personal legacy. But I certainly do think about it in terms of biophilia, right? Like my love of life and biodiversity. And of course, like even though I don't have my own children, I love children. Like I would like them to live in a safe and healthy world. And so I think this is another thing that the climate movement hasn't really tapped into is apart from joy and adventure, and I would add creativity as exciting reasons to be involved in this, that like we should just embrace that people
Amen.
do this for love.
Yeah, and I also want to say that to me, third act, people who are in that phase of life have money and power and time. And in my mind, those are things you need to be deeply engaged. And maybe you don't have to have those, and it's not a prerequisite, but I want to think that, you know, influence too, people who have had careers and maybe have ties. I mean, are you seeing that work?
We say if you have reached the age where you have hair coming out your ears, you probably have structural power coming out your ears
right.
as well. And,
I can vouch for the ear hair.
There's 70 million Americans over the age of 60, 10,000 more every day, which is more than the number of people born in this country every day. We punch above our weight politically because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. And we ended up with most of the resources. So if you want to put some pressure on Washington or Wall Street or your state capital, having a few people with hairlines like mine, I mean, you know, we'd all love to have a hairline like Ayana's, let's be honest. But, it's not the worst thing in the world to have some older people backing up the young people doing this work. The first time we did one of these demonstrations outside a bank, it was because young people had asked us to come join in, and they were like, we want to protest outside Chase, but we don't even have checking accounts, so will you come? Like, sure. And we showed up, and there were, 200 or 300 high school kids, because there always are. They understand perfectly well the barrel down which they are staring. And they're somewhat sprier, so they were in the lead of the march. But at the back, there was a group of us from this nascent third act with a big banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels." Okay? And we've gone on. Now we've got 100,000 volunteers around the country. We're good at this stuff in all kinds of ways, from getting people to vote to getting people to go to jail. And
they'll show up with their rocking chairs at a protest and just sit there and give you the stink eye.
Ayana, we're a little, we've reached the age when sprawling on the concrete outside Citibank for 4 or 5 hours at a time is less fun than you would have been. So that's right, we went to Goodwill, we got every rocking chair we could find. The Times the next day called it the Rocking Chair Rebellion.
I love that.
So it's symbolic of precisely what Ayana's talking about in that Venn diagram.
Right. I was going to ask you yours, but I think you've
absolutely
illustrated it. So I want to get our third guest up here. We have talked about power of information and money in politics a bit. We haven't talked yet about the power of the courts. So with that, I'd like to invite Abigail Dillen to join us on stage. She's president of Earthjustice. Most people have probably heard their tagline, "Because the earth needs a good lawyer." Abigail and her 200 or so colleagues serve more than 1,000 clients pro bono, all looking to use established laws to protect the environment and its people. Abigail Dillen, welcome to Climate One.
Hi.
Hi.
Full stage up here.
Honestly, I just am so excited I get to hang out with all these people. What
It's
a
a good
treat.
crew. And there are, 20 interviews you said in this book? So there's a lot
there's
of
a
really...
lot. I can't wait for the dinner party one day.
Abigail, back in the 1970s, people probably know, there was this whole raft of legislation that a bipartisan Congress introduced, environmental legislation. So we have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, I think also the creation of the EPA. Collectively, they are responsible for really transforming the way we approached our natural world, and they saved a lot of land and species from destruction. How much are these foundational laws under threat today?
Existentially. So one thing to remember about that time, which I think the climate movement is just catching up to, is that there was a holistic analysis that we were polluting our air, giving people asthma, cancer, that we were polluting our rivers, they were catching on fire, at least one of them in Ohio, that we were, our unbridled chemical industry was threatening the web of life. Rachel Carson made that one of her just incredible contributions, was to write Silent Spring. But she and many others were seeing industry. I just love Steve's poem earlier and his recognition that at some point people stopped thinking about the world as a system and as this extractable, static resource. And in the 70s, things got so bad that you had, whether it was biophilia or just pure survival instinct, even industry was recognizing that we needed to do something about it, or we weren't going to have a country you could really live in. And so President Nixon, with a bipartisan Congress, passes all of these laws that had at their core a distrust of regulated industry and government to do the right thing, because often resources run short or political will does. And so they empowered anyone who's affected. That's everybody in this room were affected in some way, to hold the government accountable, to stand in the shoes of an attorney general. It's a very, very powerful set of laws that we have in the United States, and they've become a foundation for other countries too. I'm glad to say that lots of laws around the world are now exceeding what we're doing in the US. But I know we'll get to this, but let me give you a preview.
Please.
I hope we'll get to this. Congress knew that someone was going to have to sweat the details. They wanted the laws to get stronger as technology evolved. They wanted the laws to get better and better tailored as our scientific understanding evolved. And so they entrusted experts in the federal government to evolve the regulations over time. These are broad, sweeping mandates. It says, make the waters run clean, make the air healthy. By the way, the Clean Air Act talked about the atmosphere. It anticipated climate change. Now, we have a Supreme Court that says, I don't think Congress could give that expansive authority. And we don't think experts and agencies really ought to make the calls.
Right, so you're referring to this case that came out 2022?
Not just one.
The major questions doctrine, the EPA versus West Virginia, is that the case? You can say more about it. I mean, that essentially said that, right? That these agencies are not empowered in the way that they have been for 40 years, 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, so let me say a few things about the last few terms of the Supreme Court. Never in my lifetime have we seen a court make so many big moves that fundamentally change the fabric of our society. Usually the court will make one move and wait 10 or 15 years to see how it plays out. So in the heart of COVID, they made the first big foray to say, we don't think the president has the ability to deal with a major pandemic as it pertains to workers' health. It really surprised people in the workers' rights community. Then we have this major questions doctrine firmly announced, which is the idea Congress can't make big moves, the courts will decide whether a president can or can't do something when it has vast economic or social implications. Well, that's everything our federal government does. This is a judges decide rule. Remember, the judges that were appointed during the Trump administration, not for their reputation for fairness or civility, not for their legal credentials, for two things: their position on reproductive rights and their position about the role of government, which is de minimis other than protecting private property rights and corporate interests. So that's the invitation that was given. And since then, we've had 3 more blockbusters that are pushing the envelope even further about what the scope of a president's authority do to respond to our activism.
So how does that affect the strategy of you and your peers at Earthjustice? I mean, when the laws that you're using are kind of shifting, or the understanding of them is shifting under your feet?
Well, the first thing I want to say is a de-escalation of the alarm I hope you're feeling, which is that the Supreme Court only takes so many cases a year. The signal that has been sent to a cadre of ultra-conservative lower court judges is tempered by the fact that during the Biden administration, there's been an enormous number of other kinds of judges appointed. A fair and good judge who respects science and facts is not precluded from doing the right thing. So we're still winning many of our client cases. And I like to remember, I used to go up to the lectern. I used to do that. I don't do it anymore here. But judges are people too. And whatever their ideology is, they're living in this crisis that is affecting us all so deeply and so personally.
And their children and grandchildren.
And their children and grandchildren. And so you never know, but we're still winning many of our cases, and I think that will continue to be true. And there are state courts, and there are all kinds of decisions that Third Act is trying to influence in our public utility commissions. We lawyer the hell out of everything. And a lot of that important work is insulated from this Supreme Court with an agenda. But I've had to realize that the last 50 years, 52 years of what Earthjustice has done are going to be different than the next 50. And even though it is not standard practice for a lawyer to criticize the courts, we appear in front of them. We have to tell the truth about what is happening right now. We cannot survive this Supreme Court agenda. We cannot. Either this court has to moderate itself to reflect the conditions of our time, or it must be reformed. And I think that's one of the areas we all have to be activists about.
I want to talk about a couple cases that are exciting to you, but before we get into that, there's something you write about in your interview with Ayana, the Environmental Justice for All Act. Can you say a bit about what that is? And I invite Ayana and Bill to jump in too, about the importance of if we were to accomplish getting something like that passed, what it would mean.
Oh, I'm glad you brought up the Environmental Justice for All Act, which is now named after the late Don McKibben, an environmental hero. We are having a correct conversation in the country about how we build our new society faster. And there's no question we need to get more transmission. We need to deliver clean power, scale up the solutions, and we're working very hard on that. And there are some shortcuts being proposed that we should just stop the enterprise of environmental review, that no one should have a say. And my view is, there are some things about some of these bedrock environmental laws that haven't worked. We've built fortunes in this country. We've built a lot out, and we have not shifted who has access to clean air and clean water. Your zip code still defines your future. Mm-hmm. And so the Environmental Justice for All Act is about making sure that as we build a new country, a new economy, if we get it right, that part of getting it right will be ensuring we don't build in all the old injustices that define our society and are at the root cause of where we are now. And I'll just say one sentence on what I mean by that. If we didn't tolerate the conditions in Cancer Alley of the Gulf Coast in this country, if we didn't tolerate the conditions that people live in the Ohio River Valley, we wouldn't be the biggest fossil fuels producer in the world.
Yeah.
So that's the core of what
Yeah.
this crucial act is about.
Another one of the interviews in this book is with Rihanna Gunn-Wright, who does incredible work on climate policy, who was one of the lead architects of writing the Green New Deal resolution. She's like, if everyone had to breathe this air, if rich white people had to breathe this air, we would have solved this problem long ago, right? It's the communities that live along the fence lines of these fossil fuel facilities that are dealing with the major burdens, health impacts of all of this. And so, yes, we'd all much rather catch photons from the sky than keep doing this crazy setting dinosaur juice on fire thing. And I think it just feels so ridiculous to have to say that out loud, to advocate for justice in that way, because it's just like, of course, we shouldn't be making poor people and people of color deal with all this stuff, especially given the even grosser injustice that often they're the ones that did the least to cause it all over the world.
Right.
Yeah.
That's. I was going to ask you, we've seen some court cases now targeting the oil majors themselves. We've also seen cases that are really exciting, like the ones in Montana, youth defending their right to a clean environment through the state constitution, which was cool. What is most exciting to you in the cases that you're, even if you're not working on them, that you're seeing out there right now?
Let me give two examples and one overarching excitement. My greatest fear was that as the courts became more hostile, people would say, well, guess we can't think about the courts anymore. And instead people would say, oh, we need a rule of law. And so I'm really glad that the courts are getting the attention they deserve and more of that. Two favorite cases. I bet everyone listening and who's in the room has heard about our Children's Trust, incredible young people who are coming forward to vindicate their rights to a future. Mm-hmm. And we litigated one of these with our Children's Trust in Hawaii. And I'll never forget calling up one of my best friends at Earthjustice, Isaac Moriwaki, on the days that the Maui fires were raging, just to see if he was okay and if everyone in our office was okay. And he said, we were just about to go depose the Hawaii Department of Transportation. And that was one of many, many depositions. The state of Hawaii was not like, come on in, we'd love to settle this case. They contested it. But because Isaac and the people who were litigating this really understood the power map in that state, what the possibilities were, what the problems were. In Hawaii now, the biggest emitters are the transportation section, and everyone had done their homework about what would it look like for the state of Hawaii to stepwise on a responsible schedule get the transportation problem solved. And the guy who runs the Department of Transportation thought it was a whole bunch of good ideas. and was willing to sit down with our lawyers and hammer out a settlement. It's the first of these cases that's yielded an actual enforceable roadmap. And we talk about Hawaii as like postcards from the future. I love this postcard from the future because it's something we can replicate. And so the idea of young people getting to, create the catalytic choice point for a government, and for a government of responsible people who felt those fires to stand up and say, yes, let's do this with you. That is so thrilling.
Such a big deal.
Such a big deal. One more, and I'll go quickly on this one, but we have an incredible Attorney General in the state of California. Really incredible. And the lawsuit that Attorney General Bonta filed last week against Exxon, I think it's going to change the world. It's about the lie of plastics recycling that Exxon and others, of course the fossil fuel industry, seeded. And what I think it's doing, just in that, the people versus Exxon, it has been so hard for folks to understand how oil and gas become toxic, cancer-causing petrochemicals that are then the feedstocks of plastics, which are making us sick, killing the oceans. It is the whole system in one thing that we call plastics. And I don't think there's a person in the world, you can feel abstract about energy and where you get your electricity, but none of us feels abstract about plastic. I've been enraged about my dependence on, you can't get away from it. But the fury that I feel now, knowing that I've actually entertained the belief that I could put it in a bin and it wouldn't be as bad as I know it is, wow. The deception of this industry and how it has prevented us from making the right choices for so long, it's hitting me all over again.
And making it your problem.
And making it my problem.
You're responsible for recycling.
Yes.
Not the producer of the plastic.
Yes, yes. And so
And it's not even possible. I mean, that's
You're
what the
right.
lawsuit is about. Like, you can't really recycle most plastic, right? And those numbers with those cute 3 arrows on the bottom, all that means is what type of plastic it is. It doesn't actually mean it's recyclable. Like, that is the most offensive greenwashing, right? I just...
most
Go get 'em,
offensive
Abby.
and most consequential. Yeah, no, but it's thrilling to see state attorney generals with all the extra, we've got 600 folks at Earthjustice. We're just this tiny group of people, even if we feel like we're bigger than we once were. When attorney generals of the 5th biggest economy in the world get going on this, it gives me a lot of hope. And there might be a showdown with the Supreme Court, but it's too late. We now know what the facts are. Read that complaint. It is a page turner, and I'm serious. I'm a nerd, but this one is.
But this profoundly makes the point that none of this happens, no arm of this happens by itself. So it's always a mix of litigation and legislation and protest and lobbying. I was in Montana over the weekend, and Montana is the other state where young people have managed to win a court victory in this, and the reason they were able to is because Article 9 of the Montana State Constitution guarantees the right to a clean and healthy environment and mandates that the legislature enforce it. It surprises people when they read that Montana, now we think of as quite conservative state, has this provision. It was adopted in the year or two after Earth Day, when in 1970, when 20 million Americans were in the street. 10% of the then population, the biggest demonstration we've ever had in this country. Lawyers can't do this, produce magic on their own. All of this requires that we change the zeitgeist of the world in which we live, and that's what organizing is about. That's what this book is about. That's why we engage in this kind of conversation. And sometimes that's why we go to jail. And what Ayana has so beautifully managed to do in this book is bring together the fact that there is no exact one magic solution to what we're doing. It's going to take people who have different skills, different resources, working very much towards the same end. And because the bad guys are working very much towards the same end. They have profit is a deeply unifying motive that keeps them hard at work 24/7, doing what they're trying to do. Love needs to be our motive, and it needs to keep us as hard at work over the next few years, because the next few years will be the decisive few years.
Yeah. You talk a lot about, the profit motive. I think there's there's a corollary to that I think we don't talk enough about, that you brought up in our interview, that I think everyone with a law degree brought up in their interview in this. I was like, oh, this is the unifying thing, property rights. Right? You said, when I interviewed you, the common core of all these ideas, right, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, is law that recognizes the rights of the collective. We need to move from a system that reifies individual property rights and shifts to not only account for, but truly protect the common good of public interest. So I know I'm not supposed to be the questioner, but I'm just really hoping you can say something about the way property rights really informs our ability to get stuff done in this country, because doesn't really get a lot of airtime in the climate conversation.
It's so fundamental that we don't even perceive it. It almost seems original sometimes to people when you say the one thing that we actually revere is the right to private property. So if you think about pollution, you have a right to extract, you have a right to pollute. It's just limited. And that's not going to work at a time where we have to start. We have water scarcity, we have atmospheric commons that we just have to protect forever. And the idea of rights of nature, when I was in law school, that stuff was so fringe. The idea of a public trust, so fringe. The idea of a constitutional right that it's only just 2 years ago been recognized as a human right to a healthy environment. Just 2 years ago, we filed a petition in the 90s. All of these things that we need to protect one another are just coming once again to the fore and becoming a little bit mainstream, and we have to keep going with that. I'll just say one more thing. The Supreme Court case I didn't mention, which just blew a hole in the Clean Water Act, is premised on the idea that if there is a private property right in play, Congress really, really, really can't give big authority to the executive agencies. Like, you need an extra clear statement if you want to regulate with any impact on private property rights. That's a very scary test, because it basically brings all of our environmental protections into question. They all impact private property.
There's so much more we could get into. There's so many more questions for all of you I'd like to ask, but we do want to get to a couple audience questions. And so before we do that, final question for all of you. What if we get it right? And each of you can have a turn answering. We'll start with you, Bill.
Well, let me say what it doesn't mean. We're not, stopping climate change is not one of the possibilities. And we're going to deal with a lot of grief and a lot of pain on this planet in the decades ahead, no matter what we do. But we could use the transition that we have to make, because physics requires it, to build a world far more just, far more localized, far more intelligent than the one that we inhabit at the moment. And it would be a good idea to use this thing that we have to do the things that we should have done long ago.
I can build on that. You said we've had fair warning. And for many of us, even to read Ayana's book and read the climate science, it is so different to read it now that it's happening, as opposed to read it as a future. It's like the diagnosis that you've gotten and you really want to understand. And there's nothing good about it. There's nothing good about the fact that we've let it go and it's happening. But the only thing that I see changing that gives me some courage is that there's something about the human species. We organize ourselves in some profound ways to help each other. The fact that we have medicine, the fact that we have schools, the fact that we, not well enough, but take care of each other in our old age, that we take care of each other in disasters. We're never going to get people out in the streets by saying, look, another hurricane or another wildfire. But what we are doing is starting to spur the thinking about how we're going to protect each other in this new weather. And I think that's the best of our species. And so now as we face these climate shocks, and that's a nice way to put it, really, one after another, some part of us, and I hope it's the critical mass of us, is going to engage in what my friend, after seeing us speak last night, calls love politics. Because we have to. Because we have to.
Amen.
So it's funny, like I get asked this question obviously a lot. I'm on a book tour about a book called What If We Get It Right? So like, tell me, Ayana, what does it mean to get it right? And the last chapter of my book is called Away from the Brink, which was going to be the title of the book, but I was told it wasn't cheerful enough. Actually, the original title was What Do We Become, How Humans Survive Humanity. That's what I sold the book as titled. But I actually had a lot of fun writing this last chapter, pulling from all these incredible people I interviewed and trying to weave some of their ideas together. And I won't spoil it for you by reading the whole thing, but it's a handful of paragraphs, and each starts with a "if we get it right" sentence. So I can just share a few of those. If we get it right, the world is a lot more green, more full of life. If we get it right, the combustion phase of humanity is over. If we get it right, we have relocalized and we eat well. If we get it right, our homes are comfortable. The future is not drafty. If we get it right, there is no traffic in cities because there are so few cars in cities. If we get it right, coastlines are greener too. Mangroves and wetlands and seagrasses and dune grasses have been replanted. If we get it right, the tyranny of the minority is over. The climate-concerned majority rules. If we get it right, there are fewer desk jobs, and electricians do very well on dating apps. If we get it right, the pace of life is more humane. We are unrushed, chill even. If we get it right, culture has caught up with our climate reality. Hollywood and celebrities are all in. Climate is the context. Spring is not silent. It's cacophonous. We are putting the pieces back together, adapting to the climate-changed world with eyes and hearts wide open. We embrace possibility, continually moving away from the brink and toward answers to the grand question, what if we get it right? I know it's cheating, but like I can't put it any better than that. I have to just read it to you.
It's not cheating. That was beautiful. Thank you. All right, we have 2 audience questions. We have just time for a couple. Can Sasha and Carmen please come to the mic? And I think it is over here. Whoever gets there first. Sasha?
While we're waiting, shout out to my friend Kate Gage in the front row, who is on the friend leaderboard for most book tour events attended. Friendly competition underway.
Great.
Okay, well, I have to wipe the tears from my eyes now because I want a piece of that future. Thank you so much. Following that, it's hard to ask this question, but I'd like to hear all of your thoughts on what strategies, I guess we're getting a little practical, what strategies or actually actions have you found most compelling or successful to get policymakers or regulators to pursue actionable but just and equitable outcomes over more sort of reporting or analysis? I think I was really struck, Ayana, about your comment of cost-benefit analysis. I've been in the clean energy space for decades, and yet again, we're looking at more cost-benefit analysis, more reporting. when it comes to, say, energy efficiency over, battery storage. And thinking about that and the importance of it in terms of an equitable, just transition. So what kind of strategies can we use to push our regulators, our policymakers, to have more action?
I have a quick thought on that, and then I'm very curious what others have to say, is that I think the cost-benefit thing really frustrates me because it's only looking at the costs often. Like, oh, it's too expensive to do that climate solution. I'm like, do you know how expensive it is to not do that? Right? Like, that's not fair. Like, if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, like, really do it. Like, what are the benefits of putting these climate solutions into play for our health, for limiting future destruction, right? It's not, like, we've just seen Hurricane Helene tear through this southeast of this country. That's expensive, right? So many people died. Like, that is the cost in life alone is like untenable. So anytime someone brings a cost benefit analysis to me that's only like it's too expensive to make the transition, I'm just like, get out of my face.
I would say personnel is policy, just full stop. So to work, I have been trying to change federal policy for the last 25 years. It's just a very different situation to have an EPA, to have a CEQ, to have a DOE that was constituted to deliver on equity and justice goals. And just tremendous. To have, there are very few think tanks who use equity and justice as a lens. So I think about my friend Dr. Ana Baptista at the New School, who is just doing incredibly rigorous work about what would this look like if you really thought about the outcomes for real people where this is going. And so when you have that quality of analysis, meeting people who feel it's part of their mandate from the president down to listen, then you're getting to actionable policies that work instead of a situation where you're just trying to, as often as an environmental justice advocate, trying to slow down the process because you can't get anyone to listen to you, and you can't get the funding to think about what the right actual policy is to generate the right outcome.
I think all these questions are in the end questions of power, and left to their own devices, our institutions will follow the path of least resistance, which means that the people with the most money in order to lobby them and manipulate them will win. And the only way to stand up to that is to organize. The two great inventions of the 20th century were the solar panel and the nonviolent social movement. And it needs to be, done constantly. And now they're working at their best in conjunction. Yesterday, the governor of this state vetoed a bill that would have let schools put solar panels on the roof. Not for a good reason, but because the utilities were lobbying heavily. That means that not enough people showed up to force his hand and make him do the right thing. And that's how we win these fights. And if we don't show up and organize, then we will lose these fights. That's just how it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, because we're in a wild election season, it's probably worth mentioning how much these local positions matter, right?
Amen.
The stakes are obviously incredibly high and the difference incredibly stark at the presidential level, but please do some research. Who do you want to be representing you in city council?
Get some champions in there. Yeah.
As mayors, as port commissioners, as public utility commissioners, right? These are the people deciding how fast we move as communities off of fossil fuels. Do we invest in bike lanes and public transit, municipal composting, right? All of the building codes, zoning, all of those things really matter, and it's so much easier to influence
That's right.
Local elections.
But that's the right word, is influence. The question to ask is not, will this person save us or not? The question to ask is this person susceptible to influence once they're elected? Can we effectively pressure them to get done what needs doing? Politics and elections are not synonymous. There's as much political work to be done on November 6th as November 4th. So, and I say this as someone who hasn't been home in a long time and is going to be in the purple states through election day. We got to win, but the reason we got to win is so that then we have someone we can push.
I'm taking on my book tour with me both Environmental Voter Project, because 8 million registered voters who have environment as their number one issue did not vote in the 2020 election. The environmental movement absolutely has a voter turnout problem. So if you want to volunteer to get environmentalists to just go cast their votes, join me in supporting them, volunteering with them. And then also lead locally this incredible organization that supports down ballot climate candidates who are running on a really strong climate platform. So if you aren't already fully engaged for this election season, those are 2 ways to build power for climate action beyond this election that I'm really excited about.
Amen.
Well, we are out of time, and I want to thank you all very much for this wonderful conversation and really leaving us on a high note with all that activism and ideas of how to get engaged. Ayana will be in the lobby signing books. Bill McKibben, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, and Abigail Dillen, thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
And thank you for an excellent interview.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.